As you often hear me say here on Credlo, the issue of immigration and population are topics where the devil is often in the detail. Labor, for instance, like to claim they're on a unity ticket with the government when it comes to border protection, yet in recent weeks, under the leadership of Anthony Albanese, helped along by his Border Protection Brains Trust, Christina Keneally, well, they've been anything but unity between Labor and the coalition. Then there's the fact that Australia's permanent migration numbers have dropped to their lowest levels in a decade under the Morrison government, with 160,000 visas granted last financial year, down from highs of 190,000 under the former Labor governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. Whilst that might well be accurate, it's not the full story, because net overseas migration, which is the number of people who are in this country at any given time over a 12-month period, temporary and permanent, it's running to over 230,000. That's almost 60,000 more here at any given time than the number of permanent visas that the government keeps referring to means. At 230,000, these are some of the highest numbers of net overseas migration in our history, first ramped up under Rudd, as many of you will recall. But more than that, as exposed in a substantial piece of analysis by my next guest, the skills attainment of migrants now typically coming to Australia is falling. And that's a real worry. To discuss this and more is economics editor at the Australian newspaper, Adam Creighton. Adam, well done on this analysis piece. We don't see enough of this really in papers nowadays, but you've taken a pretty heavy data set from the ABS and you've looked at who are the migrant populations in the Australian immigrant population, where are they coming from, what's their background, what's their skill set. And I have to say, I found it a fascinating set of numbers, and particularly the worry for me is that our skills attainment of people coming to Australia is falling.
Yes, look, that's right. Look, this is a product of a quiet Sunday afternoon at home, and I started looking at this data and I just realised how extraordinarily fast some of these disparate populations were growing in Australia. And I suppose the central point is just kind of how quickly the country is changing, and also the skew of the skilled migration program, the so-called skilled migration program, to a lower skilled. But the Chinese-born community in Australia is growing very rapidly. The Indian-born community is growing very rapidly. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Certainly Australia's been remarkably successful in absorbing cultures from all around the world. You'd probably say probably better than any other country. But nevertheless, the growth rates are extraordinary. So if you look at the Indian-born community, is up 56% in 5 years. And the Chinese-born is up 50% in 5 years. And I just did a quick estimate, and if you assume that things continue growing the same over the next 5 years, then the Chinese-born population will exceed the English-born population in Australia for the first time. And the Indian-born population already exceeds the New Zealand-born population, which historically, of course, has been one of the largest feeder countries in Australia. But the more interesting point, I think, is that the number of people on skilled visas, so-called skilled visas, are actually in low-skilled work. And this is actually some research done by John Daly at the Grattan Institute. He's found out that about 24% of visa holders with skilled visas are actually in low-skilled work.
OK, let's go back to the Chinese numbers and the Indian numbers. You say by 2023, which is only a handful of years away, there'll be more people in Australia that are Chinese-born that were born in England, and we know we had big waves post-war of English immigrants. So that's a big change coming down the pipeline. But the Indian numbers also intrigue me. You say that the Indian population grew 9 times population growth, overtaking New Zealanders.
Yeah, so that's right. So look, the population growth of Australia is about 1.6% a year. And so over the past 5 years, the rate of growth for the Indian-born population, I think from memory, was 56%, which is about 9 times as fast as the overall population. So it is very, very fast. So, of course, if these growth rates continue, and look, they might not continue, but if they continue as they have done for the past 5 years, then yes, you'll see these population figures grow enormously. And as I said with the Chinese figures, if I just extrapolate out and assume the past 5 years' growth is the same as the next 5 years, then by 2023, I think there'll be 980,000 Chinese-born Australians, and that's just from the mainland. By the way, that's not from Hong Kong. Hong Kong's about 120,000. And look, I said in the piece there could be problems with that. I mean, our relations with China have been deteriorating, it's fair to say, and they could get worse. And so if we have 1 million Chinese from the mainland here, presumably some of them at least will have sympathies with the homeland, quite understandably.
Yeah, look, the Irish are falling pretty fast, 9%.
Yes.
I think you had that at. Italians down, Greeks down, even Scandinavians,
Yep.
all of them down, replacing them more with our region, as I say, particularly with Chinese and Indian. What does the skill set change or the low skill employment change mean for things like productivity and this argument by the Morrison government of a clever country and looking for the most exceptionally skilled immigrants from around the world? How true can that be?
Well, certainly the government always talks about the so-called high-skilled program, but one of the economic mysteries of our time is sluggish wage growth. But it's not such a mystery really for lower skill jobs because we're bringing in so many migrants with relatively lower skills, and of course they'll be competing with native-born Australians for the same jobs. And so I don't think it's surprising to some extent that certainly in lower skilled jobs there has been a lot of stagnation in wages. For instance, the number of visa holders living in Australia either on student visas and post-study work visas, I think has increased in just 4 years from, I think, 365,000 to 580,000, I think. Now, that is an enormous increase in just 4 years. So obviously, in the short to medium run, that will put a lot of pressure on wages in certain sectors where those students mainly work. And look, let's face it, that's going to be retail, it's going to be hospitality, it's going to be construction. So you'd expect to see some stagnation in the wages there.
I want to move to home ownership because there was some interesting data out today. We know the argument that it's getting harder and harder to buy a home in Australia. I always assume that just means taking up a mortgage. If you look at the statistics out in they'll put a graph up there for people at home, but you can see that since World War II, the number of Australians buying into their first home is falling away dramatically. But what really terrified me in the statistics is in 1996, 43% of us owned a home without a mortgage. Now that's fallen to less than 30%. That's extraordinary. I mean, is there any hope that even if we buy a home, we have a mortgage, that we'll ever pay it off?
Well, look, the only hope, I think, to improve these statistics is a massive increase in interest rates, which brings down the price of houses. But, of course, that would have a lot of other problems that we would not want to see. Look, sadly, this is a symptom of our economic era, of our very low interest rate era, which has bid up the price of assets, not just in Australia, but all around the world. That is both houses, its share prices, all the price of assets have gone through the roof. And, of course, this makes it so much harder to buy. I mean, I know myself, I bought my first place at 36. Now, in historic terms, that's quite old. So it is a worry, and people are having to rely more and more on their parents to get into the housing market. But, of course, if you don't have wealthy parents, then it's very hard to do.
All right, you've got a big economic brain. Labor in here are sort of flailing around, not knowing whether they're going to junk policies, keep policies, review policies, toss them around and keep elements of this, that and the other thing. There's free advice coming from everywhere, including Wayne Swan on Friday night in a big speech, the man that's responsible, I have to say, for most of this mess. If you could say to Labor, what is the policies that they took to the last election that are the worst that they must drop in order to have credibility next time round? What advice would you give them?
Well, look, there are two signature tax policies, the franking credit policy and the negative gearing policy. I have some sympathy with the thrust of those policies, but they were proposed terribly. They just should have had a basic cap of $15,000 or $20,000 per person that applied to everyone rather than discriminate between retirees and between other people. That was just a disaster. But look, I mean, my advice would be to wait a year at least before you propose more policies, because there's so much economic uncertainty out there at the moment. You'd really want to wait and see. But the other thing I would say is they really have to rip themselves away from this obsession with increasing the compulsory rate of super to 12%. This is certainly not in the interests of ordinary workers, and that is who the Labor Party is meant, at least historically, to represent. We've seen report after report show that fees are excessively high. Even the Grattan Institute, who some people say is left-leaning, I don't think so, but some people say that, they've come out and said that to lift the rate to the SG rate to 12% will actually harm lower income to middle income workers the most. So I really think it's something Labor has to look at.
Yeah, of course, more money into super is more money in the hands of union-controlled super funds, so let's see that for what it is. But, we were just talking about buying a home, and if people are paying 9.5% now and they went to 12%, that's money that's missing out of their own pocket to buy their own home, which I have to say is what some of the best superannuation around, owning a home. Adam Creighton, as always, thanks for your analysis.
Thanks, Peter.